Good morning. Today is Sunday, November 19th, 2023. This week, with the Torah portion of Vayetze, we turn our attention to Yaakov, the third of our three patriarchs. As Yaakov begins his family, and Yaakov's family will form Klal Yisrael, the Jewish people. So I want to focus this morning on the choices that were made up until now to reach this point. Avraham had two sons, Yishmael and Yitzchak. Yitzchak is chosen over Yishmael. Yitzchak has two sons, Eisav and Yaakov. This is what we saw in last week's Torah portion, yesterday's Torah portion. Yaakov is chosen over Eisav. From this point, starting now in the Torah, there's no more choosing. All of Yaakov's children are included in Klal Yisrael, the Jewish people for all time. So why were these earlier choices made? Well, it seems simple. Avraham had two sons, Yishmael and Yitzchak. Yitzchak was a tzaddik, he was righteous. Yishmael was a rasha, he was evil, he was wicked. He tried to kill his baby brother. He engaged in immorality. Obviously, he was not the one who was chosen to continue Avraham's destiny. Yitzchak had two sons, Eisav and Yaakov. Yaakov was a tzaddik, he was righteous. Eisav was a rasha, he was wicked, he was evil, he committed murder. He was violent, he was abusive, he worshipped idols. Obviously, he was not chosen to continue Yitzchak's legacy. All of this is probably well known to all of you and is certainly well known to every Jewish day school student. The problem is that none of what I just said is actually written in the Torah. Hashem says to Hagar, a few weeks ago in the Torah portion, Yishmael's mother, God says to Hagar about her son Yishmael, who is also Avraham's son, the son of Avraham and Hagar. Hashem says to his mother, Ki l'goy gadol asimenu, I will make of him a great nation. V'hi Elokim es anar, and God will be with this boy. V'yigdal v'yesha b'midbar, and he will grow up and he will settle in the desert. V'hu roveh kashos, he will become an expert archer. That's the only thing the Torah says about Yishmael. Concerning Eisav, yesterday's Torah portion, V'yi Eisav ish yodei tzayid, Eisav was a person who was an expert hunter. Ish sadeh, he was a man of the outdoors. That's the only thing that the Torah says about Eisav. What's so terrible about those descriptions? How does that indicate that it's so terrible, so evil, so wicked? Doesn't sound so bad. How is it that we end up with Yaakov? So there's one approach, and this is a fundamental approach to interpreting and understanding the Torah, every part of the Torah. And I would call this the Midrashic approach. And that is, the rabbis, during the time of the Talmud, a little earlier, a little later, they construct background stories of the narratives in the Torah. These stories are not in the text of the Torah itself. Perhaps they are hinted in the text. But all of the faults that I mentioned before of Yishmael and Eisav, not a single one of them is in the text of the Torah itself, but rather they are found in the Midrash. The rabbis give us a fleshed out personality because the Torah really tells us very little. If the Torah just tells us one or two lines about a person, so the rabbis want to flesh out so that we have a more clear picture, full picture of what this personality is, who this is. And so the rabbis will ascribe words and actions to these characters. Now, it is complicated to know, and this is a gigantic discussion by itself. I'll just say it's complicated to know if the rabbis mean to assert that these things actually literally happened, or if the rabbis are providing context, the sense of the matter, which of course is often ambiguous and contradictory, as real life is. And so we have this all through the Torah, especially in the narratives in Bereshis. For example, Rivka agreed to marry Yitzchak in the Torah portion 2 weeks ago. How old was Rivka? Was she 3 years old, like Rashi says? Was she 13 years old? Was she 30 years old, as other opinions in the Midrash have it? We don't know. The Torah doesn't tell us how old she was. So the rabbis who each give a different age, 3 years old, I mean, a 3-year-old girl, you mean to tell me literally, really agreed to marry someone she had never met and travel away from her family for the rest of her life? I mean, maybe that's what the rabbis mean to assert, but maybe it simply means to give us different conceptions of what her consent actually meant. What a 3-year-old does is different than what a 30-year-old does. So much of the commentary of the Torah that we know, what he said, what she did. For example, much of the commentary of Rashi is Midrash. How old was Yitzchak at the time of the Akedah, the binding of Isaac? Torah doesn't say. There's one opinion in the Midrash that he was 3 years old. Another opinion in the Midrash, he was in his 30s. Now, it makes a big difference in how we understand the dynamics of that narrative. Because remember, of course, we call it Akedas Yitzchak, the binding of Isaac. To what extent was Isaac aware, Yitzchak aware of what was about to happen to him? To what extent was his consent part of the narrative? If he was 3, that's going to be very different than if he was in his 30s. Now, this is a very important part of how we understand the Torah. Again, though it is not actually in the text of the Torah itself. It is a problem, especially in the way many people are educated through Jewish schools, not to differentiate between what is actually in the text of the Torah and what is Midrashic interpretation or commentary. Many people are confused about that because in general, Jewish schools don't do such a good job of differentiating that, because this approach, this Midrashic approach, is so pervasive. I don't mean to belittle it, but we have to always keep in mind what the words of the Torah say, and then what the Midrashic interpretation is, and then to decide, is it meant as a literal addition, or is it meant in a metaphoric or a symbolic sense? Okay. Then there's another approach. And the words I would use to describe this approach is omek pshuto shel mikra, a close and deep reading of the actual text. We stick to the text of the Torah, and we read it very carefully, and we pay attention to every word, and we use our close reading of the text to interpret and understand what is happening. What does the Torah actually say about Yishmael and Eisav? For neither Yishmael nor Eisav do we see anything wicked or evil in the text of the Torah that would be a rationale for why their brother was chosen instead of them. In fact, I think in the case of Eisav, one could make the claim that Eisav, if you just looked at the text of the Torah itself, maybe he should have been the one to be chosen over Yaakov. Yaakov is acting deceitfully. Eisav is not. So let's look at the text. What do we see in the text itself? So I quoted this before. Yishmael is described to us as an aggressive archer, one who shoots bows and arrows, a hunter. Yishmael is described in this way. Eisav is described as physical, a man of the field. Now, both of them, Yishmael and Eisav, are described within the words of the Torah itself as strong, unafraid, rooted in the physical, mundane world. As opposed to Yitzchak and Yaakov, they are described to us, again within the text of the Torah, as meditative, scholarly, spiritual. Rabbi Jonathan Sacks writes that the choosing of Yitzchak over Yishmael and the choosing of Yaakov over Eisav is the fundamental lesson of Judaism, that there is more to this world than what we can see and taste and feel. The earth, in all of its physicality and materialism, is connected to heaven. The physical has a counterpoint in the spiritual. And this is the meaning at the beginning of this week's Torah portion of Yaakov's dream. Yaakov dreams of a ladder whose foot is resting on earth and whose top reaches to heaven, and there are angels going back and forth. The most basic understanding of that dream is that we cannot separate the physical from the spiritual. They are connected. They are counterparts. Now, I said to you before, and I confess, in yesterday's Torah portion, I do not understand why Rivka had to deceive her husband Yitzchak in order for Yitzchak to give his blessing to Yaakov and not to Eisav. I've suggested answers, but I confess, I don't understand it. But let's set aside the methodology, the tactic that she used. Rivka understood that Yaakov, the spiritual son, needed the blessing of physical plenty. Remember, that blessing starts with the famous words, V'yitin lecha Elokim mital hashamayim mishmani haaretz. Yitzchak said, blessed Yaakov. He thought he was blessing Eisav, but he blessed Yaakov, that God should give you from the dew of the heavens and the fat of the earth. You should have material, physical plenty. You should be able to support yourself. That's what the blessing from Yitzchak was, physical, material plenty. Because you cannot survive, Rivka understood, if you are only spiritual, if you are only meditative. You will not survive this world if that is your only mode of life. So if Yaakov is going to be the spiritual, meditative son, it was essential, Rivka understood, that Yaakov received the blessing that was intended, that Yitzchak intended for Eisav, to facilitate and sustain his spiritual life, his ability to connect to God. Because if you want to connect to God, you can't do so if you don't have food. And you can't do so if you're being attacked and you have no way to defend yourself. Because if you are only spiritual, you will not survive. Let me repeat this line because this is so relevant in today's Israeli society. if there is a segment of society that says we will only engage in the spiritual, when in fact they are needed at a certain moment for the material, in this case the military, you will not survive if you only dwell in the spiritual realm. But at the same time, you won't find meaning in life if you are only physical. If you don't comprehend that there is something beyond ourselves, something that connects all of us outside of biology, something that transcends nature, namely God, and all that God teaches us. Yitzchak and Yaakov understood that they needed both. Yishmael and Eisav did not. They were exclusively rooted in the material, physical world of the present. The Rav Yosef Soloveitchik wrote, "The central figure in Jewish history has not been the king, nor the field marshal, nor the political leader, but the teacher, surrounded by students." In Judaism and in Jewish history, we have kings, we have prime ministers, we have field marshals and generals and soldiers, we have political leaders. And these are important, and at certain times, like now, they are central. But at all times they are important because they are necessary and we respect them. We must have them. But over the course of history, the broad scope of Jewish history, those personalities are not central. Our central figure is Yitzchak, not Yishmael. Our central figure is Yaakov, not Eisav. Our central figures are those who are strong enough to live and flourish in this physical, material, sometimes dangerous, violent world, while being spiritual enough to give life meaning beyond ourselves. Yaakov becomes Yisrael and creates the Jewish people Israel. Because, as Rabbi Jonathan Sacks writes, Israel is the people who in themselves testify to something beyond themselves. Jews have consistently shown that you can make a contribution to humanity out of all proportion to your numbers, that a small nation can outlive every empire that sought its destruction. They have shown that a nation is strong when it cares for its weak and rich when it cares for the poor. Jews are the people through whom God has shown that the human spirit can rise above nature, testifying that there is something real that transcends nature, and that is a life-changing idea. We are as great as our ideals. If we truly believe in something beyond ourselves, we will achieve beyond ourselves. My friends, I wish you a great day, and I look forward to seeing you all soon in person.